Territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation on unceded lands that are colonially known as Ottawa. I honor the enduring presence, governance, and stewardship of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people, and I recognize that we're gathering virtually across many Indigenous territories on Turtle Island and beyond today. This matters for our conversation today. The report we're launching asks us what it looks like to shift authority, resources, and accountability closer to the communities driving change. On these lands, that shift begins by recognizing Indigenous rights and sovereignty, and by treating partnership not as charity or transaction, but as reciprocity, consent, and shared decision-making. I invite us all to carry that lens into today's discussion about financing and partnerships, who decides, who holds resources, and who is accountable to whom. Next slide, please. Quelques notes rapides avant de commencer. On aura d'abord une courte causerie avec l'auteur et l'autrice du rapport, so Michael Woodzicki et Rachel Logal-Carmichael. Ensuite, on passera à des réflexions de notre invité Rombeck, économiste financière sud-soudanais et leader du développement humanitaire. Puis, on ouvrira une période de questions vers la fin. Vous pouvez envoyer vos questions dans le clavardage tout au long de la séance et on reprendra plusieurs pendant le segment de questions. I also encourage you to make use of the chat if you would like to share any of resources or examples or ideas that's there for you, and ask that, of course, we all share in a tone that's respectful and constructive, and knowing that these subject can also be a bit sensitive. We'll have Mentimeter about partway through to pulse check with you as the audience. When we get there, we'll share the link and you can respond from your phone or browser. Sur l'accessibilité, comme vous savez, l'événement est interprété et une transcription est activée. Si vous avez des besoins particuliers pendant la séance, n'hésitez pas à écrire à l'équipe dans le clavardage et merci d'être avec nous ce matin. So maybe just to set the scene a little bit, today's session marks the launch of Transitioning Power, Partnerships, and Financing International Cooperation, a report that explores practical models for shifting authority, resources, and accountability closer to the communities driving change. We commissioned this work because we're in a moment of deep transition and disruption in international cooperation, and because that disruption also creates opportunities for us to do things differently. Here in Canada, Global Affairs Canada is moving forward with the Grants and Contribution Transformation Initiative, and Cooperation Canada, alongside many other organizations in this sector, have been engaged actively in those conversations. At the same time, we wanted to be bolder and more propositional around what change could actually look like. Not only identifying what isn't working, but bringing forward credible options grounded in real practice. So we commissioned this research with the support of Global Affairs Canada, so a heartfelt thank you for that support, to identify examples that stand out, whether they were examples in Canada or internationally, of partnerships and financing models that are more equitable, more innovative, and more aligned with local leadership. The goal is to learn from what's already working in different contexts and to translate those lessons into practical implications for how we partner, how we share risk, how we design funding and accountability. And this work is about two things at once. It's about what we can do as partners, as civil society, our habits, our ways of working. It's also about the systems and structures that shape official development assistance, including the rules, the incentives, and the accountability frameworks that either enable or constrain more equitable partnership. We're grateful to have worked with Michael Woodzicki and Rachel Logal-Carmichael on this, and today our goal is to bring that report to life, what it changes, what it makes possible, and what it asks of us all. D'abord, j'ai le plaisir d'accueillir Michael Woodzicki, associé fondateur de Nexus Cooperation Inc. Michael, merci d'être avec nous aujourd'hui. And I also have the pleasure of welcoming Rachel Logal-Carmichael, who's the consultant and co-author on the report. So welcome to you both, and really pleased to have you here with us today. Alors, Michael, pour lancer la discussion, si vous deviez expliquer ce que ce rapport change dans la conversation sur les partenariats et le financement, qu'est-ce que ce serait?
Mais d'abord, Shannon, merci à tout le monde qui est là. C'est un plaisir de vous voir si nombreux ce matin, tôt en janvier en 2026. Et merci, Shannon, beaucoup à toi et à ton équipe de nous accueillir aujourd'hui. Et merci d'avoir fait confiance à Rachel et à moi pour ce travail. Et surtout, merci à toutes les personnes qui ont partagé leur temps, leurs idées et leur expérience pour informer ce rapport. Votre question est toujours un peu délicate parce qu'il faudrait vraiment beaucoup d'orgueil pour dire qu'un rapport, à lui seul, peut changer une conversation. Ce que ce rapport fait, selon nous, est beaucoup plus modeste et espérons plus utile. Le rapport confirme quelque chose que beaucoup d'entre nous ressentent déjà, un déplacement du pouvoir, au moins de power shift, au moins d'une façon rhétorique et de plus en plus en réalité, est en cours depuis un certain temps, voire des années, si pas plus longtemps que ça. Un déplacement dans la façon dont les ressources sont gérées, dont les décisions sont prises et dont la redevabilité, accountability in English, est pensée. Ce n'est pas nouveau. Toutes les personnes ici sur cet appel composent avec ces réalités depuis des années. Et ce que le rapport nous apporte, on espère, c'est davantage de clarté et d'ancrage dans le concret. Ça doit être pratique. Il montre, à travers des exemples très pratiques, comment ce déplacement du pouvoir est manifeste déjà dans différents contextes, avec différents types d'acteurs et de mécanismes de financement. Il permet de rendre des changements plus visibles, à quoi ils ressemblent concrètement ce qui semble fonctionner et dans quelles conditions. Le rapport nous aide peut-être à mettre des mots sur cette transformation. Un langage pour parler du déplacement du pouvoir de manière concrète, pas seulement comme une aspiration. C'est que, on espère, ça nous permet de passer de « nous voulons déplacer le pouvoir » à des choix très pratiques sur la manière de concevoir nos partenariats, de concevoir les mécanismes de financement qu'on utilise et de concevoir les cadres de redevabilité qu'on utilise entre ceux qui ont de l'argent et ceux qui utilisent cet argent pour fomenter un changement.
Merci, Michael. Rachel, over to you. So sort of building on some of the reflections that Michael's already shared, what sort of default setting, if you will, in partnership and financing does this report challenge the most in your view? And what should replace it if we're serious about shifting power?
I think that the models that we studied challenge the idea that control equals accountability. So what we found were examples of alternatives to this donor-controlled, compliance-heavy financing, where donors define priorities and impact. And we found examples where accountability really flows to impact proxy communities as equally as it flows to funders. So we had really useful set of examples to research, including 4 models funded by the Canadian government, 1 model of an American philanthropic donor, 1 pooled fund mechanism, and 3 bilateral donors representing Scandinavian governments. And I think each gave us a glimpse of what can replace this compliance-heavy financing. And it really came down to a trust-based and relational financing architecture. So maybe I'll highlight 2 elements of what that looked like in practice. The first is investing in trust and shared governance rather than investing in compliance. So in the models we studied, this shows up as donors replacing project-by-project control with upfront investment in partner readiness and relationships. I personally love the examples of the Fund for Innovation and Transformation and the Mulago Foundation examples that we studied. So in the case of the Fund for Innovation and Transformation, which is implemented by MCIC, it invests in helping partners to decolonize compliance requirements such as log frames or reporting. So FIT, for example, provided a mentor to potential partners to use during the funding application process, with mentorship extended beyond for successful partners. FIT also found that many of the SMOs that they worked with were unfamiliar with the performance measurement framework as an evaluation tool, or they didn't have practical examples of developing one. So FIT added specific training and support to address this knowledge gap without penalizing the partner. As I said, another example was the Mulago Foundation, where the founder really designed for accountability through trust building rather than omitting any accountability requirements. And we'll talk a little bit more about Mulago, I think, further. But both of those models that I've referenced gave us a glimpse of also where we can look at sort of this future trust-based architecture through more moving from this donor-defined impact to impact defined by those closest to the proposed change. And so I think these give a bit of a glimpse of where we should be moving or we can be moving, demonstrated through these models.
Okay, thank you for that. Michael, I'm coming back to you. Quand on parle de déplacer le pouvoir, de quoi s'agit-il selon vous? Décision, budget, définition de réussite? Et pour l'illustrer, pouvez-vous citer un exemple du rapport qui montre à quoi ressemble un vrai transport de pouvoir en pratique?
Merci, Shannon. Quand on parle de déplacement du pouvoir, il est facile de le réduire à une seule dimension: le budget, la prise de décision, définition d'impact, les risques. Mais dans la pratique, ce qui ressort du rapport, ce qui ressort de tous les entrevues que Rachel et moi nous avons fait, c'est que tout cela est intimement lié. Le pouvoir se joue dans l'ensemble du système et surtout dans la relation entre ces différents éléments, ce qui revient de façon très constante dans tous les modèles analysés, et Rachel vient de parler de cela, c'est la question de la confiance, ou en anglais, comme elle vient de dire, c'est trust-based architecture. Cette confiance ne signifie pas l'absence de redevabilité, elle implique plutôt de repenser la manière dont la redevabilité est conçue. La vraie question devient donc: comment concevoir des relations et des systèmes de bâtiment qui bâtissent la confiance de façon à que les décisions et les ressources puissent se rapprocher le plus possible de celles et ceux qui font le travail dans les différents pays où nous sommes tous impliqués. Un exemple qui nous a vraiment marqué, et Rachel vient de le mentionner, est celui de la Fondation Mulago. Leur approche repose sur un investissement très important au départ, parfois une année complète, pour apprendre à connaître les leaders et les organisations avant même que le financement commence. Ce temps est consacré à l'alignement, à la clarté sur l'impact recherché, à une intention très partagée. Une fois le financement accordé, le contrôle diminue fortement, presque complètement. Les exigences de rapport sont légères, si presque pas existantes. Les approbations sont limitées et il existe une présomption claire que l'organisation ou l'individu sont les mieux placés pour décider comment atteindre les objectifs convenus. C'est là qu'on voit un véritable transfert de pouvoir. Pas seulement un transfert d'argent, mais un transfert d'autorité sur la définition de la réussite et sur la manière de l'atteindre.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that, Michael, and a really concrete example. So we've talked about like sort of the system as a whole, as what needs to change. We've talked about kind of the trust-based element to that, which obviously, requires significant investment, as the example you've laid out, Michael. Rachel, for those that are in the room but are kind of feeling stuck, we know this issue matters. We've been talking about it for years. There's a lot of themes being raised in this report that I think resonate with what we know. But when you look at these examples, what is maybe one of the first changes that can be made to shift those kind of partnership dynamics?
I think it's a great question, because I think many people in the room genuinely want to act, but feel anxious about how to do so in ways that are aligned to the commitments that we've all made around shifting the power. And there's a lot of important work underway around policy reform and operational change. But to your question, I think a concrete step while that system-wide reform is being done is really reorienting how partnership oversight is practiced. So for funders and intermediaries especially, that can mean moving from compliance-driven monitoring to maybe more of a trust-based oversight. So through the research, we saw a very practical example of what that looks like in action in Denmark. One of the Scandinavian donors that we studied, as the report outlines, the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs has long-standing framework agreements with civil society partners, which are multi-year and connected to overall funding guidelines. And it was actually really interesting to hear that these partnerships are formalized through a simple one-page commitment letter. But what really matters isn't really the instrument, it's the practice behind it. So one of the most striking things we heard as we talked to this the Danish government was how civil society is understood by the Danish government not as a grantee, but as a partner. And that's not just in language, but it's really an organizational culture. And this is how they see the concept of partnership really embedded in how they think about and work with CSOs. So the mindset of that is operationalized through the concept of tilsyn, and you'll have to excuse my non-existent Danish accent, but tilsyn is often translated as oversight, but it was described to me as more like being an obligation to your partner. So it goes beyond monitoring, and it's more about ongoing attention and professional judgment, which is operationalized through staying engaged through conversations or sort of building contextual understanding. And so this concept really should be understood more as relational than transactional. And what this translated to then, it was trust being front-loaded into these partnership arrangements. And that was done through sort of a rigorous upfront vetting of partners, which aimed to understand if the partner was able to steward resources, was able to exercise judgment, and whether they can adapt in complex contexts. And so what I love learning about this concept of tilsyn is that it sort of captured that daily experience of power in a partnership. It showed up as partners no longer performing for compliance, and that donors were sort of moving beyond paperwork. And they were shifting that conversation from, are we allowed to do this? Or are you allowed to do this, from the donor to, what are you learning and what needs to change? And I think that shift alone sort of unlocks that adaptive decision-making. It reduced transactional costs, and very importantly, it signals sort of that authority is genuinely shared. So I think if we want to see, this genuine shift in power, we need to not look for new perfect instruments tomorrow. We need to use different behaviors today.
I like that, different behaviors today. I'm gonna stay with you, Rachel, and ask you a bit of a follow-up question around something in the report that I thought was quite interesting and innovative. But before I go there, I'm just gonna ask our team to perhaps put the Menti QR code onto the screen, because following this question, we will have a chance to hear from our audience. Just a couple of questions to get the juices flowing and the thoughts going, and hear from you. So that'll give you a chance to connect while I ask Rachel the next question. So the report uses this idea of a lattice rather than a linear chain. And so really this concept's around stewardship, around shared agency, multiple pathways of accountability. Can you share a bit with our the folks on the call what a lattice model means in kind of plain language, and maybe just an example of what that can look like in practice?
For sure. So for this lattice vision, we really drew on ideas from complexity and system thinking. So how do systems work, as well as network governance? So how coordination happens. We drew on stewardship theory, which is around how people are motivated, and finally decolonial and feminist development thinking on to show how power operates. So we were wanting to challenge this model, as you said, of this traditional value chain in the aid ecosystem, where donors set priorities and control funds, where intermediaries manage contracts and risk, where partners implement and communities receive support, excuse me, and where accountability flows up that chain. So in the lattice metaphor described in the report, there's no top of the system, and authority moves to who is best placed to decide depending on the issue. So the vision is that multiple actors, whether they be donors, intermediaries, impact proximate organizations and communities, hold agency at the same time, and that accountability flows in more than one direction. So the goal really becomes stewardship and not handoffs. And the model advances the idea that money is not the only form of power, that, for example, proximity, legitimacy, lived experience, et cetera, can also carry authority. And so in this ecosystem, different actors add value at different moments. And the question between the different entities in that ecosystem is really who should decide this right now and who needs to be accountable to whom. So I think that the best example from the report to embody the lattice is the local response pooled fund in South Sudan, because of the roles and decision-making accountability that are demonstrated by local and national organizations, and then enabled by international actors and international donors. However, I'm not going to unpack the LRPF. I'm going to give another example because we're very fortunate to have Chairperson Rombach from the LRPF ready to speak to us. And so I'll hold on my example there. I'll highlight another example, which is the Equality Fund, also highlighted in the report. And I think that if we look at the Equality Fund, it can really be seen to be designed as a shared stewardship platform where authority, capital, and accountability are sort of intentionally distributed. And in the Equality Fund, there are multiple forms of capital, including women's rights organizations that bring legitimacy, lived experience, and agenda setting power. There's also philanthropic capital that brings flexibility and risk tolerance. And there's public money from the Canadian government. So accountability flows in more than one direction. As the fund is accountable to feminist movements it exists to serve, and learning is shaped through various feminist approaches, not just donor metrics. So I think the system then holds together not because of one actor being in charge, but because roles are clear, trust is intentional, and accountability is shared. So I think that's an example that we can embody what the idea of the lattice meant to impart.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that, Rachel. I think it helps make the concept clearer for sure. So we're now going to move on to our Mentimeter. I see we've got a good chunk of folks that have joined. So Chopin, if you could move to the next slide, which asks, oh, people are already into it. Okay, here we go. That's wonderful. So our those on the call have already started to think about what does more equitable partnership mean. Alors, qui signifie pour vous un partenariat plus équitable? Alors, on voit sur l'écran les idées qui sortent. So we have mutual accountability, bottom-up influence, collaboration, I suppose is a word. It's a bigger word, so it must be a key word that's coming up. Respect, mutual respect. I see trust. So many of the themes that I think we've already discussed this morning through our conversation are certainly emerging. Maybe just give it a minute to see if we have any more thoughts that folks would like to share, and then we'll go on to our next question. Flexibilité, fairness, concepts of fairness and equity, équité. Okay. Great. Let's go on to our next question, which is a little, I would say maybe it's more tough, I'm not sure, but we are asking you to rank what would make the biggest difference right now. So we've only got about, I think, 6 or 7 that have actually answered this. So we'll give it a minute. On va prendre un moment pour voir quel changement aurait le plus grand impact de moment. Okay. We're almost around half of those that are in the Menti, so I'll just give it a couple more minutes. Mais à ce moment, on voit que c'est le financement flexible. So folks are selecting flexible funding as the top ranked option at this time, then followed by simplified compliance, capacity investment, shared governance, and mutual accountability. Okay. Well, thank you, folks, for participating in the Menti. Useful to get a bit of a sense of where your heads are at as well in this conversation. And we'll now shift our conversation to bring in our discussant, Rombek, who's the chairperson for the Local Response Pooled Fund in South Sudan, founder and executive director of Global AIM South Sudan. So welcome, Rombek. It's a pleasure to have you joining us today. And just checking that we have the mic and everything all set up. Can you say hello, Rombek? I'm just trying to find you
Hello,
on
yeah,
my
yeah,
screen. You're
I'm
here.
right
Wonderful.
here, yes.
Great.
Right.
I know our colleagues will pin you to the screen, so I will see you front and center momentarily. So maybe just to kick us off, you're the chair of the Local Response Pooled Fund in South Sudan, and I think Rachel's already given some kudos for the model and how it works. In the report, it's described as a locally led humanitarian funding platform created by South Sudanese civil society to shift decision-making and resources directly to local and national actors. It's a good mouthful there. For those of us that haven't read the report, can you walk us through how the model works in practice, of who makes the decisions, how the funding flows, how you manage accountability?
All right. Thank you so much, Shannon, for that brilliant introduction. It's a pleasure to share experience from the Local Response Pool Fund South Sudan. But before then, I want to quickly tell a little bit of history or background of LRPF because it is very, very important, and the context assumption of South Sudan. In South Sudan for many years, local and national NGOs have been in the forefront to provide aid delivery, humanitarian response, but had always been very limited in terms of access to direct funding and decision-making power. This is one country that depends so much on funding from the outside world and has the largest number of NGOs, I think, after Bangladesh, because the last time I was told Bangladesh have 20,000. Very huge. Yes, the Local Response Pool Fund, of course, was founded on that ground so that at least the power shift in terms of decision making should be taken lead by the locals. And when we founded the LRPF in 2021, it was at the back of the Grand Bargain Commitment that was the conference that was conducted in 2016 in Istanbul. So basically, we were trying to follow the footsteps and operationalize the Grand Bargain Commitment towards a localized. A very simple but very ambitious vision that was to enhance access to local funding and decision making for local and national actors to deliver relief and recovery development. For now, the LRPF stands at a membership of 205 national organizations. In terms of governance, this is very important because of the question in terms of decision making. One, the LRPF is governed by a board of trustees consisting of 9 members. Of course, these 9 members are elected by the General Assembly that constitute the whose now secretariat, a fully pledged secretariat, and the secretariat provides a day-to-day of
Rombek, you're cutting out for me. I'm just going to ask for folks to maybe just turn off your camera just to help with connection. I caught the secretariat on the day-to-day
sets
pieces, but
funding
didn't catch up.
priorities. Yes.
Please continue.
All right. All right. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
All right. The board sets funding priorities and approves grants, decision-making authority before this sits or before the decision is operationalized by the fund secretariat, which is the administrative wing of the LRPF. How the fund is flowing, of course, as a very simple but very ambitious mechanism, we have put very simple but robust donors trusted chart on how funds flow. For instance, we seek donors fund where the funds all come to the pool fund, in which we then issue an open calls for proposals, and these calls for proposals strictly are shared with the members organization, the subscribers, or the General Assembly, the 200 and plus national organizations. The reason we have done that is we want to take a full ownership in terms of risk management, accountability, and transparency in terms of reporting later on the funds received. As such, we do not want to give just an open window for every registered partner to have access to our funds. This is in terms of taking full responsibility, because it's the mechanism that takes responsibility. Therefore, after that happens, the funds is then disbursed directly to South Sudanese national organizations without passing through multiple INGO layers, the INGO layers. Well, initially we had an NGO that hosts, that provides, we call it as fund custodian. But when we legally sifted out to be a legally independent and recognized institution in the country, we were able to cut off these layers of the international NGOs I'm trying to refer to here. This shortens the funding chain, reduces overheads, and speed up responses. In terms of accountability, LRPF accountability is strengthened, not weakened, because it sits closer to delivery. We use financial reporting and audits. By the way, we have more sophisticated softwares that we have also embedded in our operational management of the fund. We also have an oversight by the Secretariat and the Board of Trustees. That's to ensure the transparency and accountability I was talking about. We have peer accountability among national organizations. If I talk of national organizations in the future of my discussion, strictly I'm referring to the members organizations that subscribe to the LRPF. We also have community level feedback mechanism through the accountability to affected populations, the AAPs. This is very critical because we are right at the heart of the community. But most importantly, the model emphasizes capacity strengthening rather than exclusion, so organizations which are members can improve rather than being locked out. In terms of concrete shift in power in South Sudan, for example, through the local response pool fund, ability have received direct funding to respond to the COVID-19 outbreak some couple of years back. Climate-induced flooding and refugee and returnees crisis. You must have read a lot of reports about South Sudan, which is susceptible to these challenges throughout the year. In these cases, priorities, allocations, and adoptions were fully decided by the local actors, including mid-course change based on community feedback. This demonstrates a real transfer of decision-making, authority, and resources, not just implementation responsibility. And this is very critical when it comes to our brand as the LRPF. But the question now comes, what changes most when power shifts here? Simple answer to judiciaries, decision makers, and stewards of public resources. While LRPF South Sudan is rooted in South Sudan's context, we believe that the model speaks to a global localization challenge, how to align authority, resources, accountability with those closest to the community. I was very happy when I saw in the pool the simplified compliance, the flexible funding. Those ones are things that we really feel that now it's being understood globally. And that's what the LRPF stands for. Thank you so much, Shannon. I hope I'm able to bring out the context of the model.
Yes, thank you so much, Ramek. That's very helpful to understand. And I think you've given us a number of kind of concrete examples of how the model shifted decision-making power and resources to kind of national partners and community level actors. I want to segue with you into talking a bit more about risk. and accountability. And I think you've touched on this to some extent already in some of the comments you made and kind of explaining to us how the model works. So would be keen to hear your thoughts on kind of which risks, in your view, should be held locally, which should stay with donors or intermediaries, and why. And maybe if you have thoughts on, is there sort of one donor requirement or practice that creates a burden that doesn't actually improve integrity or outcomes?
Thank you so much once again. You know, when it comes to risk, as a financial economist, risk is unavoidable, even in humanitarian action. That is one fact. But the real question is whether risk is matched with authority and accountability. Local actors should hold programmatic and contextual risk. That's to me. And why? It's because they are very close to where the service is delivered. As such, there is access to constraints. They have implementation choices and adaptive programming decisions, where these risks are best managed locally because local actors understand the context. That is undisputable, particularly here in South Sudan. Also, relationships and trade-offs in real time occurs when this kind of risk are purely given to the local actors. They are already managing this risk daily, and localization simply aligns that reality with authority and responsibility, particularly here in South Sudan, specifically speaking. But then which risk have we thought of as LRPF that should be for the donors or intermediaries, and why so? For us, we feel in South Sudan that the biggest and the hardest risk that donors should really retain are the systematic and the fiduciary risk, which includes, of course, the sanctions and the legal exposure, the foreign policy constraints, and high-level compliance and reporting architectures. This has come up in the pool, and this is very, very critical. These risks are created by donor systems. That's the fact, how I believe it as the leader of the LRPF, not by local implementation choices. They come with decisions-making power and should remain there. That power sits. Therefore, when systematic risk is pushed downward without power, it creates fear, not accountability. And in most cases over the years, that has been the fear. People have been fearing the unknown because the systematic risk is pushed downward without the authority or power. And people tend to do things to either is capacity issue with these local organizations, but because they are really compressed. Okay. In terms of accountability and how it looks like, I just want to make a very important clarification here that accountability works best when it is proportionate, shared, and purposeful. Again, if the intention of the donor, of the owners of the money is really very clear that they want to give this money where local actors should be accountable for delivery, ethical conduct, financial integrity, and community-level outcomes. Whereas donors and intermediaries should be accountable for timely funding, realistic requirement, and enabling adaptive responses, simply because accountability should strengthen performance and trust, but not to create fear or paralysis. But that has been the worry, particularly with the national NGOs here. Many of the accountability tools being sent out are more tougher. It becomes very difficult for small organizations to really, implement. So it creates fear and paralysis within the national organizations. And therefore, in the LRPF South Sudan, accountability is designed to enable good decisions, but not to punish adaptation. And we are doing this in regards to all the wider network that they subscribe to us. When a national or NGO funded through LRPF South Sudan need to adjust activities or relocate part of its budget due to flooding access, for instance, or insecurity, which is on the rise in South Sudan, particularly in many of the communities, or community feedback, the organization is required to justify the change clearly, but it does not face automatic suspension. Rachel mentioned this because the reason is many donors tend to restrict the location. Say, okay, this is where you have intended to go. Even if you face this trouble, you are not supposed to change. The moment you just decide to write and justify the purpose for changing, you are suspended, or the approval takes long, the delays are there, finding it hard to finish the project within the timeline. So for minor and context-driven adjustments, so the local actors are accountable for results, ethical conduct, and responding to community feedback. We also believe that within the Secretariat and the board, we are also accountable for quick review, reasonable flexibility, and oversight without blocking responses, because we wanted this project to be implemented within the timelines. At the same time, if misuse, weak performance, or repeated non-compliance is identified, consequences are clear. Corrective actions, closer monitoring, or suspension, that's at the worst, because accountability is therefore real but not proportionate. Just to draw a little bit of example on this, in 2023, one of our partners had a lot of issues in terms of compliance, but the LRPF leadership, the board and the secretariat brought that partner and capacitated the finances persons. We wrote to CDP, one of our strong funder. They said, okay, instead of suspending that fund, please reduce the portfolio to this amount so that you use the other one for capacity building and use part of that money, give it to another organization. That was a very flexible decision. And that's exactly what the LRPF advocate for in terms of dialogue between the donor and the partner. Or catching mistakes after the fact. It is about enabling the right decisions at the right time while maintaining clear consequences when standards are breached. And that was what exactly we have. And non-harmonized reporting requirements. I'm still very glad that in the pool, this has really come up. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, no, that's great. I just sometimes there's a bit of a lag, so I wanted to make sure I didn't cut you off, Runbeck.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. That's anyways, there's so much juice and richness in everything that you've just said, including thinking about kind of the systemic factors and the role of kind of government versus kind of the accountability and structures for those closest taking on the risk already, and ensuring that system is proportionate, purposeful and strong. I'm going to open up the floor for questions in just a moment, but I wanted to maybe bring back in Michael and Rachel for just some thoughts. Michael, maybe I'll start with you. I had a prepared question for you, but I'm actually going to just open it up. There was a lot of richness in what Runbeck has said, and so just your reflections on what you've heard, whether you want to kind of go back on the risk piece or other pieces of the conversation, anything you'd like to add.
Thank you, Shannon, and thank you, Runbeck. It's so important that we be able to hear from you, because we talk about this really from 60,000 feet, or I guess it's 20,000 meters, and you speak from the reality of what it actually looks like in South Sudan. And so thank you for being here. I guess there's two quick hit thoughts. First of all, it's really important that when we're talking about this sort of power shift, it has to be institutionalized. This can't be informal. For real change to happen in the way that power shifted, and for those authorities, as you said, Runbeck, to be transferred, it has to be institutionalized, and it has to be created in a way where it's very deliberate. And I think Rachel talked about this earlier when she was talking about the example from our friends in Denmark, that I guess it's all of the Scandinavian countries, but we spoke to the ones in Denmark, that there's real intention at the beginning to build that trust. The second thing that's a quick hit thought is, when you're talking about risks, the way it was framed in the report was between discretionary and essential risks. And I think that you said rightly at the outset, Runbeck, that risks are always there, but it's just a question that if we can kind of really limit or be very clear about which ones are essential risks and which ones are discretionary, and then transferring, and what you said about you can't transfer systemic risks without transferring power and authority. And when you do, that's when we run into trouble. And so maybe if it's in this distinction between what are discretionary and what are essential risks. But I'd really be interested in hearing as well what resonated for Rachel in what you said, Rumbek.
Yeah, I'll pass it over to you, Rachel. I'll ask those in the audience to please, if you would like to open your mic or plop questions into the chat, please do so or be ready to do so. For now, you can certainly use the raise hand function to get into the queue. Rachel, over to you.
Thanks, Shannon. And thanks, Rumbek. Just echoing Michael's thanks. And I think, Rumbek, you've done such a great job of articulating, some of the dilemmas, but really how the design of the local response pool fund has really been intentional around looking at some of these areas. I really appreciated how you articulated how, risk, learning, and accountability are really shared across those various entities within South Sudan, and how other entities that are within the ecosystem fit into this. So maybe just one reflection building on Michael's last point around risk is I appreciated, Rumbek, how you spoke about also about that, what is risk and how different elements or entities within the ecosystem define that. And you did a really great job about illustrating that through how the system is very much built upon risks that are created by donor systems, but really the importance of looking across how each entity thinks about risk and really prioritizing those differently, and how we sort of resource different entities to support those risks and mitigate them. So thank you so much for again bringing some color to this conversation, and for your contribution to the report as well. I think others can learn a bit more detail about the local response pool fund from the actual report, as well as your information is available on the web. But thank you so much, Rumbek, and back to you, Shannon.
Okay, now it's time to hear from questions from the audience. We have a kind offer from Nick Moyer in the chat around another model that's interesting to look at, the Nunavut Community Foundation, and the model that they have used. And so appreciate that share, Nick, and I'm sure we'll have a chance to kind of look at that. I'm not seeing any there we are. All right, Brian, grateful to have you join us. And for those of you who are unaware, you've given me the excuse to mention our locally led development working group, Brian. So Brian and his colleague Marlene from Kinvia are the co-chairs of Cooperation Canada's locally led development group. And I'm really pleased that you're here today, Brian, to share some of your reflections or questions or whatever the case may be. So over to you.
Thanks, Sharon, and thanks for this research and for the very, very interesting report that's been produced. I mean, I think it touches on many, many issues, and I'd urge people to actually read the report, because it does reflect on many different experiences that speak to shifting power. And I have a question, but first just a reflection maybe on the report itself. I mean, it begins by looking at what is meant by delegated funding, and to me that's very, very important if we're actually going to be shifting power. But I think it's also important to be cognizant of the optic through which we understand shifting power. And some of the examples, not all of them, certainly, South Sudan being certainly the exception, some of the examples for me are more about shifting to program-based funding, which is, I think, a very, very important precondition for actually shifting power to the Global South. But it doesn't imply that is actually a result. As was mentioned by Michael a few minutes ago, I mean, I think institutionalizing the shifting of power is fundamentally important. And that's why the example of South Sudan is so interesting, and I think a part of our future. saying that, I mean, I may be wrong, but my understanding is that currently no Canadian CSO could actually support pooled funding directly, given the current rules on CRA. So that does raise the question of the broader enabling conditions that allow us to actually make this shift. My question to them maybe goes a bit beyond the report, but from my own experience and some of the work that we've done with the working group with colleagues in the Global South, particularly in the last year, as everybody will know. I mean, there is, I think, a desire from the perspective of the Global South to actually protect themselves from the aid regime, irrespective of what various modalities may be. And Sweden is a good example. It's a Nordic country that had framework agreements. They were blown up instantly within a few days by the Swedish government and took months and months and months to recreate something new. So the vulnerability question, I think, is front and center of many colleagues in the Global South. And so my question is, given the various models that you looked at, I mean, what within them do you think is important to consider from the perspective of those from the Global South who are looking to solidify their own development priorities within pooled funding mechanisms, for example. There may be other ways, but also to kind of protect themselves from the vagaries of the international system, be they come from donors or from INGOs themselves. So that's probably a question for Robec, but also for the consultants.
Thanks for that, Brian. And you read my mind. I wanted to start with you, Rombeck, on this question as well. What are your kind of thoughts, in terms of to Brian's point, global majority countries and partners able to kind of protect their work in light of the systemic shocks, the decisions that are made thousands of miles away that impact sustainability, impact resourcing, and so on. So over to you, Rombeck, for some of your thoughts on that.
Thank you so much. That's a very brilliant question, Brian. In South Sudan, and this is exactly, it has come at a very, very right time when Brian asked. Usually when countries depend so much on other governments to get funds to finance humanitarian aspects, it becomes very, very difficult. That means every decision that comes from the owners of the money, either even if it's subjective or objective, the recipient government doesn't have any say about it. So to me, what would have really happened in many of the governments, including my own government, there should be a proper framework in terms of what the government is supposed to contribute even to that funding, so that when eventualities of this nature comes up, either government has a say, because we put this amount of money here and you yourself, the recipient, also you put this amount of money. But as it stands now, the biggest agony we have in South Sudan, yes, we are trying to think about localization to be independent for humanitarian, but the question is the money yours? I've always faced that question as Rombek. Is the money yours? Your government doesn't contribute even a penny to the humanitarian docket. So it becomes totally very difficult in terms of flow of money that comes into the country, so that some of the monies are tied for sustainability, not just for projects and it ends there and that kind of stuff. Whether it is the humanitarian funding, the aspect of sustainability fund is loose, and I think that could be very important moving forward, particularly in the Global South perspective. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Rombeck. I'm going to come to you, Michael, to hear if you have any reflections on what Brian has shared, and then I'll just take, if there's one more question from the audience, please raise your hand. I'm happy to ask it or to hear it. And if not, I have a final closing question for our panelists. So over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Brian. As Rombeck said, it's a great question. I can't help but think of it's probably a really poor analogy, but it is one, that there is addiction to, we've talked about, like, there's an addiction to the former system. Or I say former because it's been changing, as we talked about at the outset and in one of my earlier answers, that these changes are not new. It's not with the collapse or destruction of USAID earlier this year, but the sort of changes that have been going on. And Brian, you talked about it in Sweden and elsewhere. This is not new, but there's an addiction to this former system. And so now we're transitioning off of this addiction. Either we're being forced to, or we have to, or there's elements of it that still exist. And so what happens? What does it look like not to have this, not to be addicted to this way of working? And we don't know. Like, what is, and it comes to your question, Brian, what is actual delegated financing? And do we even have the regulatory regime or the rules in place to do it? Probably not. So what is there that exists instead of that? Well, we don't know necessarily what is coming. And so as we're building towards whatever is new, and this is what the report talks about and what Rombeck has described, we have elements of what we think it should start looking like. And we've talked about trust and shared responsibility and shared accountability. You've described it as not so much delegated financing, but this shift to more delegation and program funding. And so we know, we have a sense of what this looks like, and we have a sense of what the principles and the approaches we need, and what that institutionalization for a power shift looks like. But we don't know exactly what it is. And so we, I think, are hopefully part of a conversation now about making sure that as this change is happening, it's happening in a way that best reflects the aspirations and expertise and needs and interests of those where this sort of where development is occurring. And Rombeck talked about South Sudan, and that's not only on us, but it's also, as he described, on not only on the organizations of the LPRF, but also on their governments, the governments in these countries. So we don't know what it looks like. We don't know what delegation necessarily means. We have a sense of the sorts of conditions and practical, really concrete things that we're learning from, such as the examples that we talked about in our report. And I think we're at 2 minutes to the end of the session. Sorry, this is a fascinating question, and we could talk about this for another couple of hours with everybody on this call. But I know we can't necessarily do that.
Well, thank you for that, Michael, for those reflections, for the question, Brian. There was another question from Marlon Mandaka from Kinvia, the co-chair of the Local Development Working Group, alongside Brian in the chat. I don't think we're going to have time if we want to end on time. So I think what I'll do is a final word to our esteemed guests. Rombeck, in kind of one sentence or two sentences, what's one thing that you look forward to in this space for us to watch in the coming years, coming months, that you see real change happening? And I'll ask Rachel and Michael to answer that question as well in one or two sentences. So over to you, Rombeck. Do we still have you, Rombeck?
Oh, I'm muted. Sorry.
That's okay. Yeah. So just one change that makes you hopeful that you see on the horizon.
Thank you. Yeah, just sorry for that. Yeah. I was saying one thing that I can really quickly talk about. It's very important that, one, there should be a harmonized and simplifying sense of the requirements in terms of funding. And this is especially for the pool funding and direct grants to national organizations. Because if you harmonize systems and simplify all the requirements, you find that it becomes very easy to work through. And now the issue to do with transparency and accountability will be sorted out, because everything is perfect. If we are using this software with donor A, donor B should also be using the same software. If we are using this template for donor A, donor B should use the same template. So this is what I'm trying to think about. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Very, very practical, Rombeck. Rachel, final word from you, and then over to you, Michael, and then I'll be happy to close out our session today.
I would say that there's the real glimmer maybe of hope within the report, and I think it speaks to part of some of Brian's reflection, is that the report showed us that there are models that exist that show where organizations in Canada can push against some of the limitations and barriers we have within legislation or otherwise, where there is movement, where there is opportunity for some of these shifts. And I think that that's hopefully should be an encouragement where we can see that it's happening, where we can see some of that movement in real concrete terms through what these organizations have been able to achieve.
Thank you. Michael.
One change, and I don't think it's a change, but it's a continuing practice is that makes me hopeful is that we had over 50 or 60 people on this call on a Wednesday in January to talk about this and about how to continue to ensure that this real shift in power happens. I think that really makes me hopeful that you're all here with us today.
Thank you, Michael. Those are great kind of parting words, I think, for our conversation today. So just a real heartfelt thank you, Rachel, Michael, and Rombeck, for making yourselves available to share concrete, practical guidance, findings from the report. It was a pleasure to work with you all. And a big thank you to everyone that joined the call today. We'll be sure to share the recording out as well for those that had to hop off early, for those that couldn't make it. And we really look forward to continuing this conversation, both with you as folks that are part of the international cooperation sector, whether it's in Canada or abroad, but also in our conversations with our good friends at Global Affairs Canada, and I'm sure beyond that as well. So thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, and happy to call this session to a close. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.